Oh, hello. Variable sunlight today. Bit of a pain. Never mind. I thought we'd do another sort of little literary thing. Slight variation. Children's classic. Mr. Men books. Love them to bits. We all did, didn't we, as kids? Yeah. Well, this is the tale of Mr. Muddle, which I've altered very slightly. So, with apologies to Roger Hargreaves. He's probably going to have to forgive me for this one, I'm afraid. This is Mr. Muddle. Poor Mr. Muddle just couldn't get anything right. Everything he did, everything he tried, everything he said was muddled. Totally, utterly, completely, absolutely muddled. Imagine for some instance something as simple as not shaking hands. Now, who could get muddled with that scientific advice? Mr. Muddle could get it muddled, and frequently did. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as following agreed protocols for a pandemic. Now, who could get muddled with following agreed protocols for a pandemic? Well, see for yourself. Only Mr. Muddle will ignore decades-old procedures. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as storing enough PPE. Now, what could get muddled about storing it away from asbestos? Well, when you rely on a private company to do it at low cost. Poor Mr. Muddle. Now nurses have to wear bin bags. Now, you'd probably like to know where Mr. Muddle lives. In a house by the river near a place called London. Mr. Muddle's house was supposed to be in the country, but Mr. Muddle has got the place muddled up. Of course, although he's supposed to live in London, he's usually in the country on holiday. This story starts one afternoon when Mr. Muddle was not having a press conference. Now, we know Mr. Muddle is supposed to have a press conference, but you can't do it if you're in intensive care. Mr. Muddle was being fully in charge whilst being in hospital. Others got to say he was fine, even though they hadn't seen him for days. What a terribly muddy, mixed-up situation. That evening, after oxygen, he went to his London house to clap the NHS in order to work up an appetite for supper. He met an old genius called Dominic, who he knew quite well. "Good evening, Mr. Muddle," said Dom. "Good morning," replied Mr. Muddle. Dominic smiled. "Would you like to come to home for a cup of tea with me?" he asked. "Ooh, no please," replied Mr. Muddle eagerly. "Help me get my wife and child in the car," called Dom. "That's responsible," said Mr. Muddle, and shut the child out of the car. "Oh, Mr. Muddle," said Dom, and had to show Mr. Muddle the difference between having a child and caring for it. Eventually, however, they managed to get everyone in the car. "Now let's go home," said Dom, driving north. "Islington," said Mr. Muddle as they hit the M1. "Oh, Mr. Muddle," said Dom again. He didn't understand anything about keeping children safe. "Don't worry about the rules," called Dom. "Just keep an eye out for the cops." "Perfectly legal," said Mr. Muddle, and closed his eyes. Dominic was just about to say, "Oh, Mr. Muddle," again, when he had an idea. He smiled to himself. "Just say, perfectly legal initiative," said Dom. "Righto," said Mr. Muddle, and said, "perfectly legal initiative." "Well done, Mr. Muddle," said Dom. Mr. Muddle smiled a smile and went off. Dom smiled a smile and went to tell everybody. The following day, in London, Mr. Gove, the cabinet maker, was asked if Mr. Muddle was right. "Perfectly legal initiative," said Mr. Gove. Then he went for a drive to test his eyesight. "Well done, Mr. Gove," smiled Dom. Mr. Muddle was very pleased. He must be right, because everyone agreed with him. Then Mr. Raab, the foreign man, was asked. "Perfectly legal initiative," said Mr. Raab, and asked to be allowed to speak about A-roads. "Well done, Mr. Raab," smiled Dom. Then Mr. Hancock, the care badge salesman, was asked. "Perfectly legal initiative," said Mr. Hancock, and added, "within the guidelines," because he didn't need Dom to tell him what to do. "Well done, Mr. Hancock," smiled Dom. He talked to everybody. Mr. Muddle was delighted. In fact, Mr. Muddle was so delighted he decided to go home, only to come out once a week when he had to. "Better prepared," he said to the select committee. "Sorry, I don't know." "Oh, Mr. Muddle, you were funny once on a quiz show 10 years ago." But not now.